Okay, we're just now on 1 p.m. and I'm noticing still quite a few people joining us, so I'll give them one moment. And today I'd like to welcome you all to this Mind Out webinar. It's on the latest insights into LGBTIQ plus mental health, suicide and self-harm. My name is Liz Wilkinson and I am the Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Manager here at LGBTIQ plus Health Australia, and my pronouns are she and they. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their diversities, histories and knowledge, and the continuing connection to land, water and community that they hold. I'd also like to pay our collective respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. I'd also particularly like to pay my respects to elders of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation from where I'm joining, and I'd also welcome you guys to use the chat function to share where you are joining from today. At this point, I'd also like to acknowledge people with living experience of mental health distress, as well as their carers and families, and note the continued role that they play in the reform of the mental health system. Next, a little bit of housekeeping. Our webinar today is being recorded and will be made available on the LHA website. So if you miss any information, you will be able to go back and listen to it there. For questions, we invite you to use the Q&A function, which should be located at the bottom of your screen. And we will aim to get to all of those questions that were submitted either before the session or during the session today. And we've got some time allocated for questions at the end of the presentation. So today's webinar is presented by the team from the Australian Research Centre in Sex, Health and Society, or ARCSHS, at La Trobe University. They'll provide a brief snapshot of outcomes of Australia's largest national surveys of LGBTQA adults from Private Lives 3 and of youth with the Writing Themselves In For survey. And they're also going to delve a bit more deeply into recent research into young LGBTIQ plus mental health experiences in outer suburban and rural areas, as well as suicide attempts among trans and gender diverse young people, and racism and mental health. So I think it's a timely reminder now that if anything in today's webinar brings up any issues for you, then support is available. In particular, you can contact QLife, which provides Australia-wide anonymous support for the LGBTIQ plus community, and QLife services are free, and you can call them on 1-800-184-527 or access their live web chat via the QLife website. So finally, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first presenter, Natalie Amos, who's a research fellow with ARCSHS at La Trobe.
Thanks, Liz. Great to be here. Thanks for having us here to present this data. So as Liz has mentioned, we'll be presenting data from our surveys Writing Themselves In For and Private Lives 3. I'm going to provide a bit of an overview of the surveys and the data that the analyses that we're presenting have been drawn from, as well as the overall populations, as well as their rates of suicidality. And then my wonderful colleagues, Ruby, Jean and Jordan, will present some more in-depth and more interesting new analyses that we've working on from this data that relates to suicide and mental health. And some of this has been published, some is in the process of being published. So it's all very new analyses that we're working on. So just quickly, I wanted to acknowledge, just a bit of an overview of the survey, of the webinar, which I think I've pretty much already done. So I'll just be doing an overview of the surveys and briefly about the rates of suicide among the survey samples. And then we'll have presentations on residential location among adults and young people, suicide attempt among trans and gender diverse young people, and then also racially minoritized adults and their experiences of community connection and mental health. So also just to acknowledge that the both surveys were made possible by funding from various sources, an incredible research team that worked on these surveys, and the thousands of participants that gave their time to tell us their stories. Both of the full national reports, as well as any other outputs from these data sets, are available on the ARCSHS website through La Trobe Uni, which is here. Okay, onto the surveys. So Private Lives 3 survey collected data on LGBTQ adults in Australia aged 18 and over, while Writing Themselves in 4 collected data from LGBTQ young people aged 14 to 21 years. These were both really extensive surveys. They were very long, covering a broad range of health and wellbeing topics, which included mental health and suicidality as part of it. The surveys were developed working closely with community and expert advisors throughout the entire development process, and both were promoted via social media advertising and through the networks of community and youth organisations, and were open to responses in late 2019. So just prior to the pandemic is when they were run. We collected really large samples of participants across all states and territories in Australia, with 6,835 adults participating in Private Lives 3 and 6,419 young people in Writing Themselves in 4. But more important than being just very large samples, both of these survey samples were very diverse, and we heard from large samples of people in rural areas, people from culturally diverse backgrounds, those living with disability, and a really diverse range of voices across the spectrum of gender identity and sexuality. And this has allowed us to explore mental health experiences across diverse intersections of the community. I will note that while we intended to collect data from those with intersex variations, the final sample size was very small, and we're unfortunately not able to meaningfully represent the experiences of this community using our data. So people with an intersex variation who identify as LGBTQ are included in these analyses, but we're not able to disaggregate for this population, unfortunately. We also had a very large proportion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander participants. This data is undergoing a really comprehensive data sovereignty and consultation process, so it's analysed and reported in a separate body of work than what we're presenting here. So participants in both surveys were asked about their experiences of suicidal ideation and suicide attempts in the past 12 months, as well as in their lifetime. Suicide ideation was defined as, have you experienced thoughts about suicide, wanting to die or ending your life? And suicide attempt is, have you attempted suicide or to end your own life? So this is the data from Private Lives 3 from the adult sample. And here the red bars presented here are the rates of suicidal ideation and suicide attempt in the past 12 months and ever in their lifetime for Private Lives 3 participants, while the grey bars represent these rates in the general Australian adult population. So as you can see demonstrated here, suicide attempt in the past 12 months among LGBTQ adults was 13 times higher than the general population, and lifetime attempt was 8 times higher. So really staggeringly high rates of suicidality among this population, and some of the highest rates that we see in any population in Australia. So we unfortunately can't make a direct comparison for our young people sample of those aged 14 to 21, but using the data from just the 16 to 17-year-olds, we can make a comparison to some general population data for the same age group. And again, it really illustrates outrageously high rates of suicidal ideation and suicide attempt. And this includes 3 times the rate of suicide attempt in the past 12 months than the general population, and 5 times the rate of lifetime suicide attempt. But also the vast majority here of these young people, more than 3/4, had ever experienced suicidal ideation. And while these rates are already so high for the LGBTQ samples as a whole, they were even higher among certain subgroups, and most notably participants who were trans or gender diverse reported even higher rates of suicide attempt. So among adults, more than 1 in 10 trans women and trans men had attempted suicide in the past 12 months, and about half had ever attempted suicide in their lifetime. And among young people, 1 in 5 trans women and trans men had attempted suicide in the past 12 months, and twice that in their lifetime. We also find really high rates or find higher rates of suicidality reported across other intersections of the population, including those with disability, those living outside of inner suburban areas, and from multicultural backgrounds. So that brings me on to, I'm going to hand over now to Ruby, who's first up, so Jordan, Gene, and then Ruby to present their data. So Jordan is presenting on understanding the risk and protective factors associated with lifetime suicide attempts among trans young people in Australia. So I will hand over to you, Jordan.
Cool, thanks, Nat. So as Nat mentioned, my name is Jordan. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm also a research officer here at ARCSHS. So yeah, today I'll be looking at just trying to understand the various factors that are associated with lifetime suicide attempts among trans and gender diverse young people in Australia. So just a bit of a background and rationale to kick us off. As we're probably all quite aware, or perhaps not aware, but in Australia, suicide is the leading cause of death among young adolescents and young adults, according to a new report by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. As Nat mentioned as well, trans young people might be particularly at risk, which is why they're sort of the focus of this particular research. And another sort of area, I guess, that helped sort of push forward this agenda for this research is this sort of new push in healthcare and scholarship to try and understand ways in which we can sort of understand how the queer community thrive, rather than just looking at deficit-based or damage-based kind of approaches to healthcare and well-being. So this leads us to just the general sort of aims of the current study. So limited research in this space has looked at sort of exploring, I guess, both the protective and risk factors associated with suicide attempts. Sometimes they just sort of look at one or two, one of them or the other, or just a few little ones. So what we tried to sort of do in this study, with the main aim being that we just wanted to explore sort of a whole range of factors that are associated or potentially associated with risk to suicide attempts. In particular, we also wanted to look at this with a bit more of a fine-grained sort of lens to understand factors that are a little bit more nuanced that haven't really been studied in other research before. So in terms of the sample, so we're drawing from the writing themselves in for sample here, just looking at the trans young people in this sample, which was just under 1,700 of them. All were aged between 14 to 21 years with an average age of around 17, and all were currently residing in Australia when the survey was conducted, which was late 2019, so just before the COVID pandemic started, just to have a bit of context here as well. As you can see from these sort of pie charts here, in terms of gender and sexual orientation, the majority identified under the non-binary gender identity. So these were sort of coded into these ways. And the majority identified as either bisexual or pansexual regarding their sexual orientation here as well. In terms of what we were interested in for the constructs, so our main outcome measure being lifetime suicide attempts, just as a yes or a no. This was sort of conceptualized by participants having at least one or more than one suicide attempt at any point in their lifetime. As you can see here, the results are pretty staggering as well, as Nat mentioned. So around 38% of this particular sample experienced a lifetime suicide attempt. And then we wanted to look at various factors that might relate to this. These included things like demographic factors. So a range of factors were included, like age and gender identity. We also wanted to look at home and family-based home and family-based factors. So at the sort of interpersonal lens, so factors like homelessness. We also wanted to look at community and general support factors, so how service access, for example, relates to this. As the majority of participants in this cohort were currently enrolled in education, we also looked at education-specific factors a little bit more closely here to understand sort of what's going on there and how that might relate to this as well. And finally, we looked at general stigma and harassment-based factors like discrimination and misgendering. So I'll present the results now, just as a bit of a caveat, I guess. I'll be presenting them in a bit more of a visual way. So I'm presenting them with these sort of bubbles here. and they're all sort of color-coded in either red, green, or grey. The red bubbles here represent factors that were associated with an increased likelihood of suicide attempts, so greater risk. Green were associated with the opposite, so a decreased likelihood, and the grey bubbles represent no relationships that were found in these analyses. And also the size of the bubbles represent here the relative strength of those relationships. So the larger the bubble, the stronger that relationship was in our analyses. So just taking a look at the demographic factors here. So these were not all of the ones that we tested, but just sort of a bunch of them. As you can see, there were a few demographic factors that were associated with an increased likelihood of suicide, and some that were associated with a decreased likelihood, and some that also weren't associated as well. So some of the more prominent ones here, I won't go through all of them, but some of the more prominent ones here was education enrollment was associated with a decreased likelihood, and participants with a disability were associated with an increased likelihood here as well. In terms of the home and family-based factors, so those factors that are a bit more proximal to the individual's interpersonal environment, these were the three that we explored. And as you can see here, all of them were a bit more sort of risk factors or associated with a greater likelihood of suicide attempts. These included homelessness experiences and also young trans people who had a queer family member as well, which we sort of explained a little bit more about in our paper just to try and understand what's sort of going on here. Yeah, and I'll move on to the next one. So that sort of led us to looking at community and general support factors a little bit more closely as well. As you can see here, there were a few that were associated with a greater risk in terms of likelihood of suicide attempts, and one here that was associated with a decreased risk. It's worth noting at this point as well that all of these analyses are completely correlational, so we aren't able to ascertain any sort of causation between effects in terms of which one sort of came first and whatnot. So as you can see here, for example, having access to professional support services was associated with a greater likelihood of suicide attempts in this cohort. But I guess a likely explanation for this could be that the suicide attempts perhaps preceded those young people trying to access support there. As you can see here as well, we also differentiate between level of outness and the support that is gained from outness, with the support gained from outness being a significant, almost protective factor against suicide attempts in this cohort. Cool. In terms of the education-specific factors, we find here a little bit more sort of fine-grained factors that haven't really been explored in other research so far. As you can see here, there are a few factors that might be associated with a little bit more risk, but there are also a few that sort of emerged as a bit more protective in this sense. So the key ones here being a greater level of connectedness with their school environment, and also trans young people who felt safe in using the bathroom that aligned with their gender at school as well. And lastly, we look at the stigma factors, and perhaps unsurprisingly, everything we looked at here was associated with a greater risk of increased suicide attempts. So these included sexual forms of harassment, physical and verbal forms. These were all in regards to the participants' gender, so they were harassed on the basis of their gender identity. We also explored misgendering and experiences of being outed without their consent. So this leaves me just with a sort of general summary of sort of what we find here. So in essence, looking at all of these factors in sort of combination really helps point towards various needs in terms of intervention and policy reform, but also helps us sort of understand how these factors all sort of emerge together in a way, rather than just looking at each one on an individual basis. So some factors we find were more protective than others, but overall there were still many that were associated with greater risk. As mentioned as well, we can't really draw any causal conclusions from these results, given the cross-sectional or correlational nature that we have here. In terms of sort of the general implications, what we find here is that results point towards a need to sort of better explore how these nuanced findings relate to certain health factors through a more intersectional lens. So as we know from the demographic results, some trans people were perhaps more at risk than others, according to various intersecting identities that they might have. And lastly, just a sort of a general note here is beyond continuing to advocate and sort of strive for systemic level change and stigma reduction, we're sort of arguing here that new interventions should also continue to help aim at boosting the factors that and the contexts that are a bit more protective for this particular cohort, especially including safer education environments. And that's all from me. So I'll hand over to Ruby, I think.
Jean.
That'll be me.
Sorry. There you
go. Hello. So I'm Jean. I'm a research officer with ARCSHS, and today I'll be talking to you about how community connectedness interfaces with, I guess, the relationship between racism and psychological distress amongst racially minoritized LGBT people. So yeah, let's get started. Next. Right. Racially minoritized LGBT people are a growing subsection within the broader Australian community, but they face some pretty unique challenges to health and well-being that their white counterparts may be exempt from. So this includes stuff like higher levels of anti-LGBTQ sentiment within diaspora or religious communities, racism within the LGBT community, and perceived tensions between their racial, cultural, and LGBT identity. And so the issue that we ran up against was that much of the existing research was really just focused on a specific part of this group's experiences, and in a single domain of their lived experience. So that's mostly gay and bi men and their intimate lives. So that's like sexual health and sexual racism. Next. So here are some examples of the kinds of racism that this group's experience within everyday life, right? So on the left, this is something that happened to a friend quite recently. I'm talking like a matter of maybe a week ago. And on the right, you've got something a little older, like it's from 2012. But this instance of very defiant prejudice was expressed, by one Jesse Matheson, who is a sitting board member on the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras, and he became one 3 years after this unsolicited and highly publicized diatribe about why he didn't want to date or sleep with Asian men. And so there's a sense, I guess, amongst a lot of this community that experiences of racism from their white counterparts tends to go like I guess unchecked or even unpunished. So next. So this is obviously like a really checkered picture. Like on the one hand, you have the LGBT community being a really important source of positive identity affirming experiences for racially minoritized LGBT people. And a lot of them rely on this community for more tangible forms of support, right? It's like one of the only places that they can reliably find an intimate partner or maybe friends who have similar experiences in relation to LGBT discrimination. And on the other hand, existing research does seem to suggest that racially minoritized people experience more discrimination for their race within these settings. And experiences of racism within everyday life also kind of lead racially minoritized people to expect racist treatment from their white counterparts. Next. So this complexity is reflected in how this group responds to racial discrimination. So for some, engaging with the LGBT community is a matter of necessity, and racial discrimination is sort of seen as a non-negotiable cost of meeting this need. And other people prioritize connecting with other LGBT people with similar experiences of racial exclusion. And of course, there are also others who choose to disengage with the community entirely. It's important to note that racially minoritized LGBT people respond to these experiences of discrimination with these responses across different contexts, times, and situations. So in light of that, we really wanted to make sense of how these different orientations impact psychological health and well-being. So to do that, we looked at how feelings of belonging to and participating in the LGBT community contributed to the relationship between racist experiences and psychological distress among participants who either perceived community participation as a good thing or as a neutral or negative thing. Next, please. So our racially minoritized participants made up roughly 10% of all of the PL3 sample, and multiracial and Asian people were the best represented. Asian people, we found, were most likely to experience racism, followed by Middle Eastern and then multiracial participants, right? Asian people were also more likely to report report not participating in community events when you compare them to their white counterparts. Conversely, Middle Eastern and multiracial participants were actually more likely than white participants to report participating within the past year. We also looked at how racism and hetero/cis-sexist discrimination contributed to overall psychological distress. And basically, from most groups besides Asians, heterosexism and cis-sexism contributed relatively more to psychological distress than racist experiences. Across all groups, racist experiences were contributed to overall distress that white participants just didn't have to deal with, right? So here I'm going to sort of drill in a bit more deeply into what we found in our mediation analysis. Next, please. So the first group we're looking at are people who have non-positive perceptions of participation, and we wanted to see how feelings of belonging impacted that relationship between racism and psychological distress. So this first group I'm calling the "I'm one of you, but I don't like it here" group. So people, so this group tended to have the strongest association between racism and psychological distress. Feeling like they belong to community seemed to account for like half of the psychological distress they experienced in relation to racism. So this really tells us that, feelings of belonging doesn't necessarily mean that you feel welcome in the community, right? A lot of times we sort of think of feelings of belonging as connoting these kind of fuzzy, positive connotations. But most of the time, it's really more a matter of, I guess, factual affiliation and membership. And so this sort of led us to conclude that a lot of this, I guess, negative perception might be influenced by racist experiences within community. Next, please. Second group are people who have positive perceptions of participating in community. And this is the group I'm calling "I'm one of you and I like it here." And so, yeah, we see that we have a much weaker relationship between racism and distress, but that's still significant, right? And in fact, actually, feelings of belonging inform the greater part of that relationship between racism and psychological distress. So numerically, they experience less distress in relation to racism, but a bigger part of that was accounted for by their feelings of belonging in the community. And this sort of led us to hypothesize that maybe these individuals we're still experiencing quite significant amounts of racism within the community, but they were able to kind of find support for coping with these experiences within the community itself. Next, please. So we also looked at how the relationship between racism and psychological distress ran through participation in community and social events. So there was a much smaller percentage of this relationship that ran through participation in community. And, this is in part a good thing because individuals kind of and even among individuals who had negative perceptions of participating in these community events, there's still a really important source of social and intimate connection, but we also realized that maybe these face-to-face events sort of provided more opportunity for participants to directly experience racist treatment from others within the community. And so, this group, I call them, I don't like it here, but I'm here anyway. Next, please. So the last group were people who had positive experience, perceptions of participating in community. And for this group, participating in events was actually negatively associated with reporting experiences of racism. But we found that participating in events itself didn't have any bearing on the relationship between racism and psychological distress, and this could represent how some participants, this group of participants was more selective about which community events that they attended. And, and to us, that sort of symbolized a kind of, I guess, a bit of a selective eye towards how these individuals engage with community, to the extent that they don't experience the same degree of racist experiences than their counterparts. Next, please. So what does this mean for, this is a lot of, this is very confusing for most people, but I guess basically this really just drives home that experiences of racism really kind of detract from the support that racially minoritized LGBT people gain from participating in the community. Of course, this is really individual. It's contingent on a lot of factors like your access to social and economic capital, and even other elements that might be difficult to measure, like sexual capital, right? And it's basically really important to note that this group has a really complex relationship to the broader community, and whether or not the connection to a community like helps their mental health should really be evaluated on an individual case-by-case basis. And on a more public health perspective, public health driven perspective, I think it's probably accurate to suggest that efforts aimed towards reducing health disparities within this group should maybe look to distributing these interventions through avenues other than the queer community, right? And so this is very kind of a lot of this research is very sort of proprietary. There isn't a lot of research in this field, as I previously mentioned. And so I think it's really important for us to hold in our minds how this ambivalence really affects the way that these individuals access support through community. And I think a more granular and a more tailored approach to supporting their resilience is probably what's needed to eliminate that racial health disparity. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to our last speaker, Ruby.
Hey, thanks so much, Jean. Hi, everyone. I'm Ruby. I'm also a research fellow at ARCSHS. Let's head on to the next slide, Nat. So I specialize, and I'm really fascinated in the role of place and space in influencing LGBTQA plus health identity and community connection. So I'm really pleased to be sharing with you some of our new analyses of both the private lives and writing themselves in data that explores differences in mental health and community connectedness by residential location in both of those surveys. So as Nat mentioned before, we observed quite high rates of psychological distress and suicidality in both Private Lives 3 and Writing Themselves in 4. And some of what I'm going to talk through now shows that those findings are further nuanced by where people live. So we know that, we'll just might stick on that first slide, Nat. So we know, there's some spoilers there. We know that social, political, and the environmental aspects of where we live have a real effect on our physical and mental health, as well as our sense of community and belonging in those places. And LGBTQ communities and our identities and well-being have long really been situated in urban or inner city contexts. So much so, like our queer narratives of place and how we think about queer communities are often really centered on what some scholars have called gay global cities. Think, you know, San Francisco, New York, London, or here in Australia, particularly Sydney, but also Melbourne, I guess, as well. So these are really big kind of cultural touchstones in many queer communities. And we see that filtering through, particularly to the common sort of narratives and migration patterns of moving to the city from perhaps the suburbs or small country towns as almost as a queer rite of passage. Maybe some of you in the audience today have done that yourself, moved to the city to live your best queer life. Whereas in contrast, when you think about suburbs and suburbia, particularly the outer suburbs, we often think of those as being sites of heteronormativity and the nuclear family, you know, somewhere where cool queer people would like to avoid or escape from. But we're really seeing that change now. I mean, with housing affordability, more and more LGBTQ plus people and their diverse families are increasingly present in the suburbs that we might have historically seen or thought of as being kind of normie kind of spaces. We don't know a lot about their experiences of living in those places. Much of our earlier research has focused on either inner city or just sort of urban without the nuance of inner and outer suburban, or rural areas. There's a lot of research, as I'm sure many of you would know, about the experiences of LGBTQ plus people in rural and regional areas, but we don't know as much about the nuances within and between those spaces. And some of our earlier work in the US and in Canada, as well as here in Australia, has pointed to some specific experiences of social isolation and lower likelihoods of being out or openly LGBTQ in suburbia. Now, I do preface this presentation by saying that this focusing or interest in the LGBTQ wellbeing in suburban areas does not come at the expense of the ongoing challenges that we know that queer communities in rural and regional areas face. But it is a particularly interesting thing that we're starting to see in this data. So if we just jump on to the next slide. So we're interested to look at how does mental health and community connection is now. So when we looked at the adult sample, even when we control for or take into account some of the key demographic factors like income, age, education, and employment type, cisgender adults living in outer suburbs in Australia were more likely than those living in the inner suburbs or inner city to experience psychological distress, suicidal ideation, and to have attempted suicide in their lifetimes. But we separated our analyses of the trans and cis populations out here just so that we didn't lose sight of the specific experiences that trans people of all genders face. And interestingly, we didn't find any statistically significant associations between place and mental health among the trans sample. We suspect that unfortunately trans people experience mental health challenges regardless of where they live. Although we did see that those living in outer suburban areas were the least likely to feel that their local community affirms their identity. So this data is telling us that LGBTQ adults living in outer suburbs might have specific experiences of those places that influence and impact their mental health and wellbeing differently to those in the city and in regional and rural areas. Next, please, Nat. But when we ran the same analyses with young people, our results tell a slightly different story. So where we saw that spike in that poorer mental health outcomes for cis adults in the suburbs compared to the city and even in some cases rural and regional areas, when we look at the younger sample, among cis young people, we see a much more straightforward trajectory of poorer mental health the further away they live from the city, the kind of narratives that we might expect. Notably, those living in inner cities reported greater overall happiness than those in the suburbs, while those in regional towns and rural areas were more likely to experience distress, suicidal ideation, and to have attempted suicide. Among trans young people, we also saw those higher levels of distress and lower levels of happiness in regional and rural areas, even more so than in suburbia. So taken together, these findings suggest that LGBTQ people have different experiences of well-being and place across their lives. Living in the suburbs or living in a regional and rural area might look very different as a queer or trans young person compared to when you get older. Some reasons for living, the reasons that people choose to live in those places are probably a big factor here. So like, for example, if you've chosen to relocate from a city into a regional or rural area as an adult, you might have greater mobility and access to social supports than if you were born and just grew up in those locations as a young person. You know, you've chosen to live there, you're living your best cottagecore life. That could be associated with better outcomes compared to if you were just, grew up there, stuck there, kind of thing. So all this points to there's something, and we wanted to explore a bit more that the factor there around social support and community connection. I mean, as Jean mentioned, the LGBTQ community belonging and connectedness to queer community is kind of complicated in our diverse communities, but we do know that in lots of past research, LGBTQ community connection and affiliation has been really associated with or is seen as a buffer against the effects of stigmatization and oppression that can lead to minority stress and some broader mental health challenges. So it can be a protective factor. And we often find that people who have that stronger sense of connection to queer community, greater self-acceptance. Next, please, Nat. And next again. So we also found place-based differences in the degree to which our survey respondents participate in and see themselves as belonging to LGBTQA+ communities. So again, controlling for those demographic factors, we found that cisgender adults who live in outer suburban areas were less likely than those in the inner city to see themselves as being part of LGBTQ communities. But they were also less likely to see this as something that was positive or something that mattered to them. At the same time, among trans people, we see that those living in regional and rural areas were less likely than elsewhere to feel connected to LGBTQ communities and also just see this as a positive part of their lives. So this bodes similar kind of challenges to what Jean was mentioning about how, as LGBTQ communities and community organisations, health organisations, how do we respond and support the needs of these members of LGBTQA+ communities when they don't see themselves as strongly affiliated? And it may point to, similarly, as Jean said, finding other ways to connect with those communities or to offer the same kinds of supports or information in different kind of places. Now, we tried to measure community connection in writing themselves in. We used a slightly different measure for young people. So we looked at young people's engagement with LGBTQ youth events. We know that's not exactly the same measure, and it's not 100% accurate in measuring how they feel connected to communities, but it's interesting and works nonetheless. So while there was no significant association with location and event attendance in cisgender young people, trans young people living in inner city areas were the most likely to attend LGBTQ youth events. This may be that there might just be more events, and particularly more events that they may see as being more appealing or inclusive of trans people, young people in particular, in those places. So what does this all mean? If we just head over to our final slide there, these findings do indicate that as we kind of know already, but that LGBTQ mental health and community connection are or may be very shaped by residential location. But we found that place-based narratives of LGBTQA+ well-being aren't as simple as just urban good, rural bad. Their story is much more complex with some nuances within and between different locations and across the life course as well. So at this critical time in the ongoing development of policy and services for LGBTQA+ communities, we really need to take into account these nuances and not to take a sort of one-size-fits-all approach in the way that we deliver the information and services that we have, and also, where those services are located. This work kind of points to the need for finding new ways to engage with local communities, and also to take on strength-based approaches in this work. So to be collaborating with local communities, particularly the sort of grassroots networks, social groups in certain places, and to make the most of the strengths that do already exist throughout those locations. That's it from me. Well, this paper has been published, so if you're interested to read it, just the findings on adults, the stuff on young people is on the way, but if you scan that QR code, you can read the full paper for adults. But thanks so much, everybody. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Natalie, Jordan, Jean, and Ruby. I found those presentations thoroughly insightful, and I'm sure they've given our listeners a good overview into some of the mental health and suicidal distress felt amongst LGBTQA+ communities throughout Australia. Now we're looking through the questions that have come through. Did anybody, we haven't got a lot of questions at the moment. Did anybody on the panel want to answer any of the questions that they got live? Or
yeah, I can jump in.
Listeners?
Lake's question here about how the boundaries between place in my study were defined. So they were in the survey, they were self reported. So we gave participants the option to, it was, I think, I can't remember exactly how it was framed, but it was like, where do you live? Inner suburban, outer suburban, regional town, rural or remote area. So it very much was up to the individual participant to self-define the place that they lived, which we know is not perfect, because what an inner suburb or an outer suburb looks like is different for different cities. But I guess so it's not, and I've had this conversation, being in Melbourne, our idea of what an outer suburb is, and thinking of it as this sort of emanating out from the city, looks very different to in Sydney, where you've got kind of pockets of, sort of the breakdown is different. But I guess it's still really relevant, given the self-determined approach to this is important, because it's how people feel about where they live. And we see that coming through in that data, where we have people who know that they live somewhere that they class as an outer suburb having less access to services and community and things like that. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Ruby. Another one that was, sorry, Jordan or Jean.
Oh yeah, I just noted that Jack in the question and answer was sort of mentioning, I guess, about issues of funding and investment, and I guess research, and that disjoint between research illuminating need and funding emanating from the gaps identified in research. And I definitely understand and identify with that frustration. Recently actually authored a paper on this exact issue within the family, domestic, and sexual violence sort of sector. And it's definitely the case that a lot of times governments will insist on more and more evidence before they've any, I guess, remit to act, and that definitely feels as if they're detracting from the issue and refusing to meet what is essentially a very urgent need. I think that there isn't really a very simple answer to dealing with this sort of, I guess, in a lot of senses, a red herring. But I think one of the best ways that we can maybe approach that is to highlight that this is an issue that, no, we do have this evidence available. We do have, indication that there's a really strong need in relation to, for instance, trans health and well-being, and I think that's sort of how we should approach these gaps, by really just making it very clear that I guess in a sense, we see what you're doing. No, we don't need any more evidence. It's time for you to actually invest in robust services instead of doling out small amounts of research funding as a way to appease the community. Sorry, that's slightly political. I hope that answers, it's not an answer, but I hope that kind of clarifies our thoughts on this issue and sort of our approach to I guess, addressing it.
Thanks, Jean. And I think from reading Jack's comments, I think Jack appreciates that ARCSHS isn't necessarily in a position to solve these issues, but we're all on a similar page. Jordan, did you want to cover that question on correlation between suicidality and having a queer family member?
Yeah, absolutely. I responded to Ren. Yeah, so I think it was quite a nuanced finding in our data, being that greater likelihood of suicide attempts were also associated with having an LGBTQA plus family member. Whilst that finding, I guess, did sort of, I guess, occur in the paper, or in the analyses rather, it is a bit tricky to sort of really quite understand or sort of figure out what's going on there or why we might have got that result. So as a bit of a caveat as well, the result was a bit more on the smaller end. It wasn't a sort of a big correlation. And I guess it also kind of counters sort of my own sort of inherent gut feeling kind of narrative where if you grow up surrounding by positive environments, meaning that if you have queer people in your immediate environment growing up, that might be actually more beneficial for you. Whereas we sort of found the opposite for that, being that maybe having a queer person, like a queer family member, might have the opposite effect. So the way we sort of explained that could be the sense that if you have a queer family member who's also been discriminated against or perhaps treated unfairly in the family environment as well, maybe subject to homelessness or home displacement. There could be various factors there that are observed by the trans young people. Of course, it's not a perfect explanation, and we certainly need more research to really unpack this effect further. But that's sort of, yeah, just sort of an interesting finding there. It's also worth noting that there's various limitations in how that question was asked. So we asked about if they just had a family member who identified with the community, but we don't really know, I guess, the closeness of that family member. It might be an extended family member, it might be a parent, it might be a sibling. And I guess we also don't know if that family member also identified as trans or gender diverse as well, in line with the participants themselves. So yeah, while it's an interesting effect, I guess we do need a bit more knowledge out there to unpack it a bit further before we make any solid conclusions, I'd say.
Thanks, Jordan. Jeanette's also asked a question in the chat, is there much known about the correlation between people's occupation and levels of well-being in LGBTIQ plus communities? Correlation between occupations and
so I've addressed that slightly within the chat, and with respect to specific occupations and specific industries, no, but we do have quite a bit of data that relates to income, and access to, I guess, economic opportunity and I guess wealth in a more casual sense of the term. And so, yeah, we do have some of that coming out in the forthcoming report, Rainbow Realities, and the results obviously demonstrate quite a, I guess, some ways unsurprising connection between economic deprivation and mental health, well-being, and outcomes. But there is a small but and kind of growing body of research about specific occupations, mostly in sports, and I think mining is one of them. But otherwise, most of what's available relates to just corporate contexts, I suppose. Yeah.
Thanks, Jean. So I think we've covered all of our questions and we're basically at the end of our time. Nat or the team, did you want to add any final thoughts? No, all good. Okay, wonderful. Thank you all again for joining us today, and many thanks to our special guests from ARCSHS. Really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and time with us today. And yeah, I'd invite all of the participants to please complete our brief survey. I'm going to post that in the chat now, and you should get prompted by Zoom to complete that after you finish up on the call as well. And yeah, don't forget that there is support available if this session has brought up anything for you. With QLife, for example, you can call on 1-800-184-527 or go to their web chat and chat to somebody live on the QLife website. So I wish everybody a great rest of the day. Thanks again.